If you weren't paying attention, the Emergencies Act inquiry is still ongoing on Parliament Hill. More and more witnesses and testimony is coming forward once again, pointing to the fact that the Trudeau Liberals overstepped. I'm Adrienne Batra. With me are Brian Lilley and Jamil Javani. Okay, Brian, I want to tie this all up because Canadians aren't paying as much attention as say we are. So let's sort of go through some of the explosive testimony that we heard this week. We heard from National Security Advisor to Justin Trudeau, Jody Thomas, who contradicted Brenda Lucki, the RCMP commissioner. But Thomas said that we don't necessarily need to listen to CSIS and that she saw through tweets that there were issues with the convoy.
This is a real problem here. The Emergencies Act is very clear on when and how it can be invoked. And what the Trudeau government did was invoke a public order emergency. The legislation doesn't say, invoke this and declare a public order emergency when you feel like it. There are key conditions. One, there has to be a national emergency that no other existing law in Canada can deal with. Okay, was that test met? No, it wasn't. We've heard that. Second, the public order emergency has to involve a threat to national security as defined in Section 2 of the CSIS Act. Section 2 of the CSIS Act gives detailed examples of what constitutes a threat to national security under those conditions. CSIS, in their report to the cabinet, said this does not meet it, and here's why. And they went through all the different things, including the foreign funding. Brenda Lucki so CSIS didn't think the Emergencies Act, the legal threshold was met. Brenda Lucki, the RCMP commissioner, said that there were tools still available. They hadn't been used. The Ottawa police had finally developed a plan, although she didn't tell cabinet that because she's incompetent. But then Jody Thomas said, well, we don't need to listen to CSIS. We need a better definition. No, the law is clear. I'm sorry, National Security Advisor Thomas, you don't get to decide what the legislation says. You're a bureaucrat. If you want to change the legislation, quit, run for office, and get legislation changed through Parliament. This is just another week of showing the incompetence of everyone involved in this, but also that the legal threshold for invoking the Emergencies Act wasn't met.
Jamil, I think that I talk about Canadians sort of being tuned out to this. I go back to the one issue that, regardless of where you fell on supporting or not supporting how you felt about the trucker convoy, when the bank accounts were seized, that tipped the scales. Canadians were generally really uncomfortable with that whole notion, with how we're treating our fellow citizens for democratically exercising their right to protest. I'm wondering, with all this testimony that's going on, does this move the needle? Does this affect anything, even if we look towards the next election, regardless of the outcome of the Commission's report?
Well, certainly Canadians who are concerned about the government overreach and freezing bank accounts, including, as I like to remind people, freezing a bank account of a single mom who works as a waitress in British Columbia. I mean, it was really an example of disturbing government overreach. And Canadians who are worried about that, I think, should look at what's happened here and see that the government really needed to manufacture a lot of reasons in order to get to this point. You have, of course, Brian's very well stated point that they needed to create essentially a new working definition of a national emergency because the law did not afford for this abuse of government power. But the other thing that we learned from Jody Thomas's testimony is that they also needed to rely on invoking the January 6th Capitol building attack in Washington, D.C. They mentioned that as an example of what they were afraid of. And any Canadian looking at this must ask themselves, I mean, what exactly was similar? When did Canadians run into a government building and threaten any politician's life? When was violence against people inside government buildings actually a real threat? That was never proven or established, and yet Jody Thomas invokes January 6th as if it's a rationale for changing the way we think about a national emergency in Canada. So, yeah, not a lot of evidence backing up the decisions made by the Trudeau Liberals at all.
Yeah, those hot tubs and bouncy castles, Brian, they really really proved to be a big problem. Look, I'm not discounting the honking and the incessant noise and those very real issues that the residents of Ottawa felt and experienced throughout that course of time, unfairly or not. I'm just worried, and this is going to be the last word to you. I'm concerned that as we hear more and more testimony, this is going to go on for some time. I mean, they'll wrap for Christmas and whatnot. But as the report is being crafted and written, as far out of Canadians' minds, it's way past anything in terms of holding this government, holding Liberals accountable. The NDP is not going to do anything with it, regardless of what the findings are. So where does that leave us?
I'm not sure where Justice Rouleau's going to come down, but my fear is that just an awful lot of people are going to put on their partisan jerseys and agree or disagree with what is released based on how they feel about the convoy now. Look, I am someone who thought the Ottawa police did a horrible job from the first weekend, because I've watched them handle huge protests in the past. I've been in the middle of those protests. I've seen how professionally they can handle them and what a disaster this was. And I'm someone who called for the Ottawa police to clear that protest out after January 30th, because, yeah, you have the democratic right to protest, but that doesn't mean you get to live on the street with your 18-wheeler in front of Parliament indefinitely. That's not a protected right. You go home at night, you come back, you protest but you don't block streets forever. We don't allow that anywhere else, and we complain about it with railway blockade. So I wanted it gone. But I also can look at this and say, this did not need the Emergencies Act. It just needed effective policing. I think that at the end, we're just going to see, if you didn't like the convoy at the beginning, you're going to say it was justified no matter what. And I'm already seeing that. And we're seeing that from Jody Thomas, trying to change the definition of how and when you can invoke the Emergencies Act retroactively, and saying essentially that the ends justify the means. That's not how a democracy should work. So let's hope that Justice Rouleau sends a strong report rebuking the government, and that they at least have the public shame of that.
Let's not forget, Justin Trudeau's Liberals went harder after Canadian citizens than they are against China interfering in our democracy. Log on to Facebook and Twitter. Let us know what you think, and go to thetorontosun.com for more stories like this and coverage you will not find anywhere else.